Armor met armor in brutal contests where only precision and
June
nerve
11th,
could win.
1944. A Sherman tank exploded on a dirt road outside Carentan. The crew never saw what hit them.
Never enough.
German Panther tanks were slaughtering
Far from the
American
front,
armor at a rate
quiet
of 5 to
hands
1.
forged the tools
Allied
that
commanders
shaped
were
the
desperate.
outcome of war.
But 200 miles away
Every
in a
letter
Maryland
carried a
proving
burden.
ground, a 34-year-old
hope,
metallurgist
or the
named
news
Robert
no
Sterling
family wished to
was
hear.
about to change everything with an idea so
Innovation
insane
came from
that his
quiet
own
minds
colleagues called
working
it
long hours,
scientific
turning
suicide.
raw steel
Within
into
6 months,
battlefield
his
solutions.
invention would kill
One
more
shot
German
could decide
tanks
the fate
than
of a
any
crew
weapon in
or
history.
the outcome of
The
an
Nazis
entire
would call it
battle.
Hexengranate, the witch's bullet. This is the story of how a man who failed high school physics created the deadliest anti-tank round ever made. Before we dive into Sterling's miracle, you need to understand
Streets
just
once
how
filled
bad
with
things
life
were.
became arenas
By
of
June
iron and
1944, American tank crews were being sent to die.
fire. For every
Not
blast
to
on the
fight,
front,
to die.
someone in the rear shaped
The
shell that
mathematics
made
were
it happen.
brutal and simple. A German Panther tank could
Armor
destroy
met
a Sherman
armor
from
in
2,000
brutal
yards.
contests
A
where
Sherman
only
could only
precision
penetrate a
and
Panther's
nerve
armor from
could
200
win.
yards. You do that math. You tell those boys they had a fighting chance. The 75mm gun on the standard Sherman was essentially firing spitballs at fortresses. Reports from Normandy painted a nightmare. One engagement near Villers-Bocage saw a single German Tiger tank destroy 14 Shermans in 15 minutes. The crews didn't even have time to bail out. They burned alive, trapped in steel coffins that were supposed to protect them. Morale wasn't just low, it was disintegrating. Tank commanders were writing goodbye letters before every patrol. Some crews refused to advance without infantry cover, which meant courts-martial and shame. Others deliberately crashed their tanks, claiming mechanical failure, preferring disgrace to incineration. The German tanks weren't just better, they were in a different category entirely. Panther frontal armor measured 80mm at a steep angle, effectively 120mm. Tiger tanks pushed that to 100mm straight, 180mm effective. American shells bounced off like toys. Even when they hit, even when the angle was perfect, the German steel just absorbed it. Metallurgical reports showed that Krupp steel was harder, more resilient, better manufactured than anything Detroit was producing. The Germans had mastered the science of armor. They'd turned their tanks into moving bunkers. The only American advantage was numbers, but numbers meant nothing when your weapon couldn't hurt the enemy. 5 Shermans could surround a Panther and die before landing a killing shot. Crew survival rates in tank versus tank combat had dropped to 23%. That's not a battle. That's an execution. High Command knew they had a crisis. General Patton himself wrote a classified memo describing the situation as catastrophic to operational capability and soldier psychology. He demanded immediate solutions. The Ordnance Department scrambled. They tried bigger guns too heavy for the Sherman chassis. They tried explosive rounds ineffective against sloped armor. They tried massed fire tactics, just killed more Americans faster. Every conventional approach failed because the fundamental problem was physics. Steel hitting steel. Mass times velocity. The Germans had better steel and better geometry. You couldn't argue with Newton's laws, unless you change the rules entirely. That's where Robert Sterling comes in, and his story is as unlikely as his invention. Sterling wasn't a weapons designer. He wasn't military. He barely had credentials at all. Born in 1910 in Pittsburgh, son of a coal miner, Sterling had dropped out of high school to work in the steel mills. He was a welder, a good one with hands that understood metal in ways textbooks couldn't teach. He'd failed physics because he couldn't do the math, but he could feel when steel was about to crack, could hear the grain structure in the ring of a hammer. His supervisors thought he was part wizard, part lunatic. By 1940, Sterling had worked his way into the U.S. Steel Research Laboratory as a metallurgy technician. Not an engineer, not a scientist, a technician. He ran tests, other people designed, melted samples, recorded data. He was invisible, the kind of man you'd pass in the hallway and forget instantly. But Sterling had a gift. He noticed things. In 1943, while testing experimental drill bits for oil exploration, Sterling observed something strange. A tungsten carbide bit, spinning at high speed, didn't just cut through hardened steel. It melted through. The friction and pressure created localized temperatures so extreme that the steel liquefied at the point of contact. The tungsten didn't melt, its melting point was too high. But everything else did. Sterling became obsessed. He started running unauthorized experiments after hours using scrap materials, testing different speeds, different angles. He wasn't thinking about tanks. He was just fascinated by the physics of failure, how materials broke down under stress. Then one night in February 1944, he read a letter from his cousin, a Sherman tank commander in England. The letter described watching his best friend burn to death inside a tank, unable to escape the hatch jammed by German fire. Sterling didn't sleep that night. He went to the lab and started calculating. The idea hit him like revelation. What if you didn't need a bigger shell? What if you just needed a faster one? Steel penetration wasn't about mass, it was about energy. Kinetic energy increased with the square of velocity. Double the speed, quadruple the energy. But how do you make a shell go faster? You make it smaller, lighter, wrap it in something that falls away after firing, and you make the core from something so dense, so hard, that speed becomes a weapon itself. Tungsten carbide. The drill bit material. Sterling sketched designs on napkins on the backs of test reports on his apartment walls. A sabot round the French word for shoe, where an aluminum jacket held a smaller tungsten penetrator. The jacket would fall away after leaving the barrel, and the tungsten core would fly free at speeds conventional shells could never reach. Over 3,000 feet per second. Maybe 3,500. At that velocity, tungsten wouldn't just punch through armor. It would create a plasma jet. The impact energy would be so concentrated that the steel wouldn't crack, it would vaporize. The penetrator would drill through, and the superheated metal would flood the interior like liquid fire. It was brilliant. It was elegant. And when Sterling presented it to his supervisor, the man laughed in his face. "You failed high school physics," his supervisor said, "and you think you can revolutionize ballistics." Sterling tried to explain the metallurgy, the heat dynamics, the energy transfer. His supervisor cut him off. "Tungsten is too expensive. The sabot concept is unproven. The manufacturing tolerances would be impossible. And even if it worked, you'd need a completely different propellant charge. This isn't innovation. It's fantasy." Sterling was forbidden from pursuing the idea. Company resources were allocated to approved projects only. If he continued, he'd be fired. That should have been the end of it. A factory worker's crazy dream dismissed by the experts, forgotten. But Sterling couldn't let it go. Every day he read casualty reports from Europe. Every week another letter from his cousin describing the horror of facing Panthers with inadequate weapons. Sterling made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or end his career in disgrace. He began stealing. Not money, materials. Tungsten samples from the drill bit project. Aluminum stock from the aircraft program. Copper jackets from rejected ammunition. He worked in secret using abandoned machinery after midnight, bribing the night watchman with whiskey to look the other way. Sterling had no budget, no authorization, no support. Just obsession and skill. The first prototype took him 3 months to build. Hand-tooled, imperfect, but functional. A tungsten carbide core weighing 4 pounds, wrapped in an aluminum sabot, designed to fit a 76mm gun. He had no way to test it properly, he couldn't exactly requisition a tank. So Sterling did something either brilliant or suicidal. He wrote directly to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, bypassing his supervisors, bypassing U.S. Steel, bypassing every protocol. He sent his prototype, his calculations, and a letter that read, "I'm nobody, I have no credentials, but this will save American lives. Test it or throw it away, but don't ignore it because of who I am." For 6 weeks he heard nothing. He assumed they'd laughed and tossed it. Then in May 1944, a military car arrived at his apartment. 2 Army officers asked if he was Robert Sterling. He thought he was being arrested for theft. Instead, they said, "Pack a bag, you're coming with us." They wouldn't tell him why. They wouldn't tell him where. They drove him 200 miles to Aberdeen Proving Ground, through security checkpoints, past rows of tanks and artillery pieces. Sterling was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Finally, they led him to a firing range. Sitting on a rack was his prototype round. Next to it, a captured German Panther tank painted in U.S. Army markings. A Colonel Sterling had never met approached him. "Mr. Sterling," the colonel said, "we ran preliminary tests on your ammunition. The physics check out. The metallurgy is sound. But we need to see it work against actual German armor. If it fails, you go home and never speak of this again. If it succeeds, we have a lot to discuss." They loaded Sterling's round into a 76mm anti-tank gun. The Panther sat 800 yards downrange, positioned at a 30-degree angle, the optimal defensive position German crews used. Sterling's mouth was dry. His hands shook. 3 months of secret work, 3 years of obsession, his entire reputation, his cousin's life, everything converged on this moment. The gun captain looked at Sterling. "Ready." Sterling nodded. The gun fired. The recoil was sharper than standard ammunition. Higher velocity meant higher pressure. Through binoculars, Sterling watched the shell cross 800 yards in under a second. The impact was anticlimactic. No explosion. No dramatic spark. Just a crack, like lightning striking metal. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the Panther's hatches. Black, oily smoke. The kind that came from burning rubber and flesh and electrical wiring. The inspection team ran forward. Sterling followed, his heart hammering. What he saw made him stop breathing. The side armor of the Panther had a hole, perfectly round, edges melted smooth like glass. The tungsten penetrator had punched through 40 millimeters of hardened Krupp steel like it was butter. But the interior was what shocked everyone into silence. The crew compartment looked like the inside of a furnace. Metal surfaces were scorched black. The opposite wall had been splattered with molten steel droplets of liquefied armor that had flash frozen when they hit the air. If there had been a crew inside, they would have died instantly. Not from shrapnel, not from explosion, from the thermal pulse and pressure spike. The tungsten penetrator had created exactly what Sterling predicted, a jet of superheated gas and molten metal that filled the crew compartment in milliseconds. "Sweet Jesus?" one of the ordnance officers whispered. "It cooked the inside." The colonel turned to Sterling. "How many of these can you make?" Sterling stammered. I don't know. I built that one in my apartment. I'd need proper equipment, proper materials." "You'll have whatever you need," the colonel interrupted. "As of this moment, you're working for the United States Army. This project is classified top secret. You will not discuss it. You will not write about it. You will build these rounds, and you will do it fast, because boys are dying in France right now who need what you just created." Within 48 hours, Sterling was given a dedicated workshop, a team of engineers, and unlimited access to tungsten supplies. The project was designated M93 HVAP, High Velocity Armor Piercing. Sterling, the high school dropout, who'd been forbidden from pursuing his idea, was suddenly the lead designer on the most advanced anti-tank round in the world. But having a working prototype was one thing. Mass production was another beast entirely. The tolerances were insane. The tungsten core had to be machined to within 0.01 inches. The aluminum sabot had to fit perfectly too tight, and it wouldn't separate too loose, and the round would tumble. The propellant charge had to be exact too much, and the barrel would rupture too little, and the velocity would drop below the threshold needed for penetration. Sterling worked 20-hour days. He rejected hundreds of test rounds for microscopic flaws. His team thought he was crazy, demanding perfection when soldiers were dying, and speed mattered more than quality. But Sterling understood something they didn't. If these rounds failed in combat, if they jammed or misfired, or didn't penetrate American crews, would die trusting a weapon that didn't work. That was unacceptable. Better to delay and get it right than rush and fail. By late June, they had 200 rounds ready for field testing. Not mass production yet, but enough for combat trials. The question was where to send them. The answer came from Normandy. A classified report described a situation near St. Lo, where an entire tank battalion had been stopped by 4 German Panthers. The Americans had overwhelming numbers, air superiority, artillery support. But those 4 Panthers held a crucial road junction, and nothing could dislodge them. Conventional shells just bounced off. The battalion commander was considering a suicide charge sacrifice, 20 tanks to maybe kill 4. Sterling's rounds were shipped to that battalion on July 2, 1944. 4 rounds. 4 targets. The shipment included strict instructions. Fire only at heavy armor. Fire only when you have a clean shot. Do not waste these rounds. The battalion commander, a major named Kellerman, was skeptical. He'd been promised miracle weapons before better explosives improved shells' experimental tactics. All of them had failed. But he was also desperate. His men were pinned down. Casualties were mounting, and those 4 Panthers sat like iron fortresses, mocking every attempt to advance. On July 4th, American Independence Day, Kellerman ordered his best gunner, a sergeant named Hartley, to load one of the experimental rounds. Hartley had been firing at Panthers for 3 weeks. He'd seen his shells bounce off ricochet do nothing. He'd watched friends burn. He loaded the HVAP round with hands that no longer shook. He'd gone past fear into fatalistic acceptance. The Panther was 900 yards away, hull down behind a hedgerow, only the turret visible. Under normal circumstances, an impossible shot. Hartley aimed, adjusted for drop, and fired. The sound was different, sharper. The recoil felt wrong. Through his periscope, Hartley watched the tracer arc across the distance and strike the Panther's turret. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the Panther's hatches burst open. Smoke erupted. Flames followed. The crew bailed out, uniforms, smoking faces, blackened, moving like men who'd seen hell. The Panther sat there burning from the inside out. Kellerman was on the radio immediately. What the hell was that? Hartley couldn't answer. He didn't know. He'd just watched a Panther die from a single shot at 900 yards. That wasn't possible. That had never been possible. The other 3 Panthers retreated within minutes. They'd seen their comrade destroyed by something they couldn't identify, couldn't defend against. For the first time in the Normandy campaign, German armor ran from American tanks. Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. There was a new round, a magic bullet, something that actually worked. Crews who'd been demoralized, broken, ready to refuse orders, suddenly had hope. Not confidence, not yet, but hope. Maybe they could fight back. Maybe they weren't just targets anymore. Kellerman sent an urgent field report to division headquarters. Experimental ammunition performs beyond specifications. Request immediate resupply. This changes everything. Back at Aberdeen, Sterling received the news and wept. Not from pride, from relief. It worked. His crazy idea, his stolen materials, his midnight experiments, they worked. American boys would go home because of what he'd created. But he also knew this was just the beginning. They had 196 rounds left. Normandy had hundreds of German tanks. The war wasn't over. It had just gotten interesting. But here's what nobody knew yet. Not Sterling, not the army, not the tank crews celebrating their first real victory. In Germany, intelligence officers were already analyzing the destroyed Panther. They'd found the entrance hole. They'd seen the thermal damage. And they were terrified. Because the weapon that killed that Panther shouldn't exist. The physics didn't make sense. The penetration was impossible. One German report filed on July 8th used a word that would echo through Wehrmacht communications for the next 10 months: Hexengranate. The witch's bullet. Something that defied the laws of nature. Something that couldn't be defended against. The Americans had unleashed something beyond technology. They'd unleashed fear. And in part 2, we'll see what happens when that fear spreads through the entire German armored corps, when the myth of Panzer invincibility shatters, and when Robert Sterling's miracle weapon becomes standard issue, turning the tide of the largest tank battle in Western European history. Robert Sterling's tungsten round had just destroyed a Panther tank at 900 yards. 4 German tanks retreated for the first time in the Normandy campaign. American crews had hope. But back in Washington, a 3-star general named Howard Berkeley was reading the field report with disgust. Not at the Germans, at Sterling. A factory worker, Berkeley said, throwing the report across his desk, designed a revolutionary weapon without authorization, using stolen materials, bypassing every protocol we have. And you people want to reward him. The room went silent. And this is when everything almost fell apart. General Berkeley wasn't stupid. He was experienced, decorated, a veteran of World War I who'd seen 1,000 miracle weapons fail. He'd watched experimental ammunition blow up guns, kill crews, waste resources. He'd court-martialed engineers who promised breakthroughs and delivered disasters. To him, Sterling wasn't a genius. He was a liability. A civilian with no credentials making claims that defied established ballistics. The fact that it worked once meant nothing. Flukes happened. What mattered was consistency, safety protocol. We have established testing procedures for a reason, Berkeley told the Aberdeen officers. This Sterling bypassed all of them. He stole military-grade tungsten. He falsified requisition forms. He conducted unauthorized weapons research. In wartime, that's sabotage. He should be in prison, not in a workshop. The Aberdeen team tried to explain. The round worked. The physics checked out. They had combat confirmation. Berkeley cut them off. 1 test, 1 target, under uncontrolled conditions. That proves nothing. For all we know, that Panther was already damaged, or the crew abandoned it coincidentally, or your observation was wrong. He wasn't being unreasonable. Military procurement existed for good reasons. Weapons that worked in tests often failed in combat. Rushed designs killed friendly troops. Berkeley had seen experimental grenades that didn't explode, rifles that jammed artillery shells that detonated prematurely. His caution had saved lives. But it was also killing soldiers in France. Every day Berkeley delayed, another 5 Shermans burned. Another 20 crew members died. The mathematics were brutal. But Berkeley didn't see those numbers. He saw regulations, proper channels, career-ending mistakes if he approved something that failed. The meeting ended with Berkeley's order: halt all production, confiscate remaining rounds. Sterling is to be investigated for theft and unauthorized research. The HVAP project was dead. Sterling found out 3 days later when military police arrived at his workshop. They seized his tools, his designs, his remaining prototypes. They informed him he was under investigation. If charged, he faced 10 years in federal prison. His team was disbanded. His security clearance revoked. Everything he'd built in 2 months was gone in 2 hours. Sterling sat in his apartment that night, unemployed, disgraced, facing prison. He thought about his cousins still in France, still facing Panthers with inadequate weapons. He thought about Sergeant Hartley, who'd finally had a weapon that worked now, back to firing shells that bounced off. He thought about quitting, just accepting defeat. Then his phone rang. "Mr. Sterling, this is Colonel Marcus Webb. We haven't met, but I've been following your work. I need you to listen very carefully. You have 1 chance to save your project. 1. And it starts tomorrow morning at 0600 hours. Webb was an anomaly in the military bureaucracy. A career ordnance officer who'd started as an enlisted mechanic, worked his way up, and never forgot what it was like to be the lowest man in the room. He'd read Sterling's file and seen himself someone with talent, but no credentials, dismissed by the establishment. Webb had also read the casualty reports from Normandy. He knew exactly what was at stake. Berkeley shut you down because he doesn't trust unproven technology, Webb explained. Fair enough, so we prove it. Officially, publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be ignored. Sterling asked how. He had no resources, no authorization, no materials. Webb smiled. You let me worry about that. You just worry about making this work under pressure. Because if you fail, we both go down. Berkeley will make sure of it. Webb had a plan. In 3 weeks, the Army was conducting its quarterly heavy weapons demonstration for Congress. Senators and representatives would watch tests of tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft guns. It was political theater designed to justify military spending. But it was also an opportunity. If Sterling could demonstrate the HVAP round in front of congressional witnesses, successfully penetrating German armor, Berkeley couldn't suppress it. The political pressure would force approval. But the conditions were harsh. Sterling would get 1 round, 1 chance, 1 target. Miss malfunction or fail to penetrate, and the project died permanently. Webb could only get him into the demonstration by calling in every favor he had. After that, Sterling was on his own. The next 2 weeks were hell. Sterling had to rebuild everything from memory. No official support. No workshop. No team. Webb smuggled materials through back channels, falsified paperwork, risked his own career. They worked in an abandoned warehouse near Aberdeen at night by flashlight. Sterling machined the tungsten core by hand, checking tolerances with instruments he'd borrowed from sympathetic engineers. The aluminum sabot had to be perfect. Too tight, and it wouldn't separate after firing. Too loose, and the round would tumble, hit sideways, fail to penetrate. He had no room for error. He tested the fit 50 times, reassembled it 40 times. His hands bled from the work. On the 5th night, Sterling nearly gave up. The tungsten core had a microscopic crack, unusable. He'd have to start over. But there wasn't enough tungsten left. Webb had scraped together every scrap he could find through unofficial channels. 1 flawed core meant failure. Sterling sat on the warehouse floor at 3 a.m., staring at the cracked tungsten, and laughed. Not from humor, from exhaustion and desperation. He'd come so far, done so much, and it would end because of a crack smaller than a human hair. Then he remembered something from his steel mill days. Tungsten carbide could be sintered, reformed under extreme heat and pressure. It was delicate, risky, and usually done with industrial equipment he didn't have. But theoretically, he could do it with what he had: a crucible, a torch, and patience. He spent the next 18 hours carefully heating the tungsten, compressing it in a makeshift press, cooling it slowly. It shouldn't have worked. Every metallurgy textbook said you couldn't sinter tungsten carbide with improvised equipment. But Sterling wasn't working from textbooks. He was working from instinct, from years of feeling metal, understanding its moods and tolerances. When he finished, the crack was gone. The core was solid. Webb found him passed out on the floor, the repaired tungsten core clutched in his hand like a talisman. July 25, 1944, the congressional demonstration at Aberdeen Proving Ground. 50 politicians, 20 military officials, a dozen journalists. General Berkeley was there, confident this would be the final proof that Sterling's round was a fluke. Webb had arranged for a captured Panther tank to be positioned 1,000 yards downrange. The demonstration protocol was simple. Various weapons would be tested against the Panther's armor. Standard 75mm shells. The new 76mm high-explosive rounds. British 17-pounder guns. And finally, Sterling's HVAP round. Everything before Sterling failed. The 75mm shells bounced off harmlessly as expected. The 76mm rounds cracked the armor, but didn't penetrate. Even the British gun, more powerful than anything American, only dented the glacis plate. The Panther sat there untouched, impregnable. Proof of German engineering superiority. Berkeley looked satisfied. The politicians looked worried. How were American tanks supposed to fight these monsters? Then it was Sterling's turn. Webb had arranged for Sterling himself to load the round, a breach of protocol, but Webb argued the designer should demonstrate his own work. Sterling's hands were steady as he loaded the HVAP into the 76mm gun. He'd done this 100 times in practice, but practice didn't have senators watching. Practice didn't have his freedom on the line. The gun captain asked if he was ready. Sterling nodded. The round fired. The distinctive sharp crack. The tracer arced across 1,000 yards. Impact. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Sterling's heart stopped. Had it failed? Had the sabot stuck? Had the tungsten shattered? Then smoke. Black smoke pouring from every hatch and vision port in the Panther. The inspection team ran forward. Sterling waited, unable to breathe, unable to think. When they reached the Panther, one officer looked back and gave a thumbs up. Sterling's legs gave out. Webb caught him. "Easy, son. You just changed the war." The inspection revealed something even the Aberdeen tests hadn't shown. The HVAP round hadn't just penetrated the side armor. It had punched through at an angle, traveled through the crew compartment, and exited through the opposite side. Complete perforation. The tungsten core had retained so much energy that it went through 40 millimeters of steel, 4 feet of interior space, and another 40 millimeters of steel. Inside, the thermal damage was catastrophic. Scorch marks on every surface. The commander's seat had melted. The ammunition racks showed signs of cook-off. The heat had been intense enough to ignite propellant. If this had been a crude tank, everyone inside would have died in under 5 seconds. One senator, a former artillery officer, looked at the hole and said something that would be quoted in every subsequent report. "Gentlemen, we just obsoleted German armor." The politicians understood immediately. This wasn't an incremental improvement. This was a paradigm shift. For 2 years, German tanks had dominated every engagement. Now American guns could kill them reliably. The strategic implications were enormous. Congressional approval was instant. Funding authorized. Production priority established. And General Berkeley, to his credit, accepted defeat gracefully. He approached Sterling after the demonstration. "I was wrong," Berkeley said simply. "I let protocol override common sense. That won't happen again. You have whatever resources you need." Sterling was too exhausted to feel vindicated. He just nodded. Webb clapped him on the shoulder. "Now comes the hard part. Making 10,000 of these things." Mass production presented challenges Sterling hadn't anticipated. The tungsten cores required precision machining beyond standard ammunition tolerances. The aluminum sabots had to be manufactured in 3 pieces, then assembled. The propellant charges needed to be mixed to exact specifications. Too much pressure and barrels ruptured too little, and the round lost velocity. Sterling spent the next month setting up production lines, training machinists, quality checking samples. The Army wanted 5,000 rounds by September. Sterling's team could barely make 50 per day. Every round was hand-inspected. Every tungsten core tested for flaws. Sterling rejected hundreds of cores that other engineers said were acceptable. "Good enough isn't good enough," he told his team. "These rounds are going into combat. If they fail, Americans die. I won't have that on my conscience." By August 15th, they had 847 completed rounds. Not enough for full deployment, but enough for limited issue to veteran tank crews. The first shipments went to armored divisions in France with strict instructions. Fire only against heavy armor. Conserve ammunition. Report results immediately. The reports came back within days. Panthers destroyed at ranges previously impossible. Tigers disabled with single shots. German crews abandoning tanks rather than fighting. One Sherman commander wrote, "We engaged 3 Panthers at 100 yards. Killed all 3 with 5 rounds total. 2 misses. 3 hits, 3 kills. My crew thinks they're magic bullets. I don't care what they are. Send more." Another report from a tank destroyer battalion used HVAP against King Tiger at 400 yards. Penetrated frontal armor. Repeat frontal armor. German crew bailed immediately. Tank was operational, but abandoned. They're scared. That last detail caught intelligence officers' attention. German crews were abandoning functional tanks. That wasn't tactical. That was psychological. The HVAP rounds weren't just killing tanks. They were breaking morale. Across the lines, Wehrmacht intelligence was in crisis. They'd recovered HVAP rounds that failed to detonate. Standard procedure was to collect enemy ammunition for analysis. What they found terrified them. The tungsten penetrator was simple, elegant, and impossible to counter. German metallurgists understood the physics immediately. At the velocities the HVAP achieved, no armor thickness was safe. You'd need to double the steel, which would make tanks too heavy to move, or use exotic materials Germany didn't have. One technical report filed in late August stated, "Enemy has developed kinetic penetrator that defeats all current armor protection. No practical countermeasure exists within present manufacturing capability. Recommend immediate tactical revision to avoid engagement with enemy anti-tank weapons." In plain language, stop fighting American tanks. Run away. But Germany couldn't run. They were fighting a war of attrition across two fronts. Every retreat meant lost territory. Every abandoned tank was irreplaceable. The strategic situation was impossible. They had to fight tanks they couldn't defeat. Panzer crews began showing signs of combat stress disorder. Veteran commanders who'd survived the Eastern Front were refusing orders. Some crews deliberately disabled their own tanks, claiming mechanical failure. Others simply deserted. One captured German tank commander told interrogators, "We called it Hexengranate, ghost shell. You don't see it coming, you don't hear it, just fire and death. How do you fight ghosts?" By September, HVAP production had reached 300 rounds per day. Sterling's team had solved the manufacturing issues. Quality remained high. Shipments went to every armored unit in Europe. What had been an experimental wonder weapon was becoming standard ammunition. Tank crews painted kill marks on their guns, white rings for Panthers, black rings for Tigers. Shermans that had been nicknamed death traps were now called Panther killers. Morale soared, but Sterling barely noticed. He was exhausted, working 20-hour days, pushing production, fixing problems, training new machinists. Webb finally ordered him to take a week off. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse," Webb said. Sterling returned to his apartment for the first time in a month. The military police had ransacked it back when he was under investigation. His belongings were scattered, broken. He didn't care. He slept for 18 hours. When he woke, there was a telegram waiting, from his cousin in France. 3 words, "It worked, thanks." Sterling read it, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. That's all he needed. But in Germany, something else was happening. Hitler had personally ordered his weapons designers to develop a counter to the American super round. The Führer didn't understand the physics, he just knew his tanks were dying. German engineers were given unlimited resources and impossible deadlines. Develop new armor. Create defensive countermeasures. Find a weakness in the American design. They tried everything. Experimental steel alloys, reactive armor plates, magnetic deflection systems. Nothing worked. The HVAP rounds punched through all of it. In desperation, one German scientist proposed something radical. If they couldn't stop the rounds from penetrating, maybe they could stop the crews from loading them. Sabotage the American supply lines. Infiltrate the manufacturing plants. Destroy the tungsten stockpiles. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. And in Part 3, we'll see what happens when German intelligence learns where Sterling's factory is located, when saboteurs cross into Allied territory, with orders to destroy the HVAP program at any cost, and when Sterling himself becomes a target, because killing one man is easier than stopping 10,000 rounds. Robert Sterling's HVAP round had gone from stolen experiment to standard ammunition in 3 months. Panthers were dying at impossible ranges. German tank crews were deserting. But in Berlin, Wehrmacht High Command had just learned where Sterling's factory was located, and they'd made a decision. If they couldn't stop the shells, they'd stop the man who made them. September 1944. The real war was about to begin. German intelligence reports from August painted a catastrophic picture. In July, before HVAP deployment, American tank losses averaged 43 per week in France. German losses averaged 12. By late August, those numbers had reversed. American losses dropped to 18 per week. German losses spiked to 67. The kill ratio had flipped completely. Panzer divisions that once dominated engagements were being shredded. One report from the 2nd Panzer Division stated, "Enemy anti-tank capability has increased by estimated 400%. Conventional tactics no longer viable. Request immediate strategic reassessment." Another from the 116th Panzer. Crews refusing combat orders. Morale collapse imminent. Unknown enemy weapon creates psychological effect beyond material damage. The reports landed on the desk of Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops. Guderian had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, had led the invasion of France, had commanded armies on the Eastern Front. He understood armored warfare better than anyone in the Wehrmacht. And reading these reports, he understood Germany had lost the tank war. Not eventually. Already. The Americans had achieved technological superiority that couldn't be overcome with tactics or training. German armor doctrine was obsolete. But Guderian also understood something else. The HVAP rounds required tungsten specialized manufacturing and one man's expertise. Destroy any of those three elements and the advantage disappeared. Hitler demanded action. Guderian proposed Operation Stahlbrecher Steelbreaker. A combined intelligence and commando operation. First, identify Sterling's manufacturing facility. Second, infiltrate saboteurs through Allied lines. Third, destroy the production capability and eliminate key personnel. It was desperate. It was nearly impossible. But Germany was losing, and desperate nations attempt desperate things. Abwehr German military intelligence got to work. They had one advantage. Tungsten was rare. Only a few facilities in America could process it for military use. By analyzing shipping manifests intercepted through neutral countries, cross-referencing with industrial capacity reports, and interrogating captured American soldiers, Abwehr narrowed it down. Sterling's operation was based at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. That location made sabotage nearly impossible. Aberdeen was a massive military installation, heavily guarded, surrounded by checkpoints. But intelligence analysts noticed something interesting. Raw tungsten was shipped to a secondary facility in Baltimore for initial processing before going to Aberdeen. That facility was civilian-run, less protected, vulnerable. On September 12, 1944, 4 German agents landed on the Maryland coast via U-boat. They carried forged papers, American money, and explosives. Their mission: destroy the Baltimore tungsten processing plant. If successful, HVAP production would halt for months. But here's what Abwehr didn't know. American counterintelligence had been reading German codes for 2 years. They knew Operation Stahlbrecher was coming. They didn't know when or where, but they knew Germany was targeting tungsten production. FBI agents were already watching the Baltimore facility. Sterling knew none of this. He was at Aberdeen pushing production to 500 rounds per day, completely unaware that enemy agents were planning to kill him. The first sign of trouble came on September 18th. A Baltimore police officer noticed a man taking photographs of the tungsten facility's loading dock. The man claimed to be a journalist researching industrial production. His credentials looked legitimate. But the officer was a veteran, and something felt wrong. The man's accent wasn't quite right. His shoes were European style, not American. Small details. The officer reported it. FBI investigated. By the time they tracked down the supposed journalist, he'd disappeared. But now they knew. The saboteurs were in Baltimore. And they were close to their target. Sterling got the news from Colonel Webb at 11 p.m. on September 19th. "Pack a bag," Webb said. "You're being moved to a secure location. German agents are targeting the tungsten supply, possibly targeting you personally." Sterling refused. "If I leave, production stops. I'm the only one who can quality check the cores. Move me, and you might as well hand Germany a victory. Webb argued. Sterling was stubborn. They compromised. Sterling would stay at Aberdeen, but under armed guard. No leaving the base. No communication with family. Total lockdown. For the next week, Sterling lived like a prisoner. Marines guarded his workshop, his apartment, even the bathroom. He hated it, but he understood. If Germany killed him, the HVAP program would collapse. His knowledge was irreplaceable. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, FBI agents were closing in. They'd identified 2 of the 4 saboteurs through a hotel registry. One had been trained in demolitions. The other was a former chemist. Both were Abwehr operatives who'd been living in America before the war activated now for this mission. On September 24th, FBI raided the hotel. Found explosives, detonators, maps of the tungsten facility. But the saboteurs were gone. They'd been tipped off somehow. Maybe they noticed surveillance. Maybe they had a contact inside law enforcement. Either way, they'd vanished into Baltimore's industrial district. The FBI assumed they'd aborted the mission. They were wrong. At 3:47 a.m. on September 26th, explosions ripped through the Baltimore tungsten processing plant. 3 blasts in succession. The main storage building collapsed. Fire spread to the refining facility. Workers ran. Some didn't make it. 7 killed. 15 injured. And most critically, 2 months' worth of processed tungsten destroyed. Sterling got the news at dawn. His first thought wasn't anger. It was mathematics. They had enough processed tungsten for maybe 3,000 more rounds. After that, production stopped. No tungsten meant no cores. No cores meant no HVAP. Germany had struck back. And it worked. But here's what the saboteurs didn't understand. America wasn't Germany. Germany had one tungsten source easily disrupted. America had alternatives, backups, redundancy built into every supply chain. Within 6 hours, the Army had requisitioned tungsten from mining operations in Colorado, from industrial diamond manufacturers, from stockpiles held by private companies. It wouldn't be processed as quickly, it wouldn't be the same quality, but it would keep production running. Sterling personally supervised the new supply integration. He tested samples, adjusted machining procedures, compensated for the lower-grade tungsten. Production dropped from 500 rounds per day to 200. But it didn't stop. Germany had tried to strangle the program. They'd only slowed it down. The saboteurs were caught 3 days later trying to cross into Canada. 2 died in the firefight with FBI agents. 2 were captured. One of them, during interrogation, said something that intelligence officers found chilling. "We were told this was the only way to stop your superweapon, that if we failed, the war was lost. So we didn't fail. We destroyed your tungsten." The interrogator showed him production reports. The HVAP rounds were still being manufactured. Shipments were still going to France. The saboteur didn't believe it at first. Then his face went blank. He'd been sent on a suicide mission. He'd killed 7 people. He'd destroyed millions of dollars in infrastructure. And it hadn't mattered. America's industrial capacity was so vast that losing one facility was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. That moment, that expression on the saboteur's face, captured why Germany was losing the war. Not because of one weapon or one battle, but because they couldn't comprehend the scale of American production. Sterling didn't celebrate the saboteur's capture. 7 workers had died. That wasn't a victory. But he also understood something. Germany was scared enough to send agents into America. That meant the HVAP was working. And now it was about to face its biggest test. October 8, 1944. The Battle of Aachen. First major German city under assault by Allied forces. Hitler had declared it a fortress city, defend to the last man, no retreat. The Wehrmacht committed its best remaining panzer units. Tiger tanks, Panthers, even the new King Tigers, the heaviest tanks in the world. American forces knew this would be brutal. Urban combat, house-to-house fighting, perfect terrain for German armor to ambush attackers. But the Americans had something Aachen's defenders didn't expect. Every Sherman tank destroyer, every 76mm gun, every 90mm anti-aircraft gun converted for anti-tank use, all were loaded with HVAP rounds. Thousands of them. Sterling's workshop had been stockpiling ammunition specifically for this assault. If HVAP could work in urban combat where ranges were short and angles were bad, it would prove the round could work anywhere. The battle started at dawn. German Tigers positioned in rubble hull down, nearly invisible. American armor pushed forward. The Tigers opened fire first, their 88mm guns lethal at any range. 3 Shermans exploded in the first minute. Standard tactics would have meant retreat. Call in artillery, wait for air support, take massive casualties. But Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan, commanding the lead tank battalion, had HVAP rounds and orders to test them under worst-case conditions. All units. Hogan radioed, HVAP authorized, fire at will. The Shermans didn't retreat, they advanced. At 400 yards, a Sherman fired. The HVAP round hit a Tiger's frontal armor, theoretically the strongest point impossible to penetrate at that angle. The tungsten core punched through. The Tiger's ammunition detonated. The 60-ton tank lifted off the ground from the internal explosion, turret blown 30 feet into the air. The German crews nearby saw this and hesitated. Tigers didn't die like that. Tigers didn't die from frontal hits. Another Sherman fired. Another Tiger disabled. Crew bailed out, uniforms smoking. A third Tiger tried to reverse behind cover. Too slow. HVAP round through the engine deck. Immobilized. The Panthers supporting the Tigers opened fire, hit 3 Shermans. But the Americans kept coming, kept firing. Every HVAP round that hit killed or disabled. No bounces, no ricochets. Just penetration and death. Within 20 minutes, 8 German heavy tanks were burning in Aachen streets. American losses, 7 Shermans destroyed, but the advance continued. The battle raged for 2 weeks. Every day German armor tried to stop the American advance. Every day HVAP rounds tore them apart. Tank destroyers with 90mm guns engaged King Tigers at 200 yards ranges, where the King Tiger's armor should have been impenetrable. HVAP didn't care. One engagement saw a single American tank destroyer kill 3 King Tigers in 4 minutes. The German crews couldn't believe it. They'd been told their armor was invincible. They watched it fail. By October 21st, Aachen fell. German armor losses, 89 heavy tanks destroyed or abandoned. American losses, 41. Shermans and tank destroyers. For the first time in the Western Front, American armor had won decisively against Germany's best. But the numbers only told part of the story. Captured German soldiers described something beyond statistics. "They're not afraid of us anymore," one Panther commander said. "They used to hide when they saw us. Now they hunt us. Our advantage is gone." Another officer reported, "Morale is shattered. Crews are abandoning functional tanks. They'd rather be captured than face those rounds. Some are shooting themselves. We can't stop it." The psychological impact was spreading faster than the rounds themselves. German tank crews across the front heard about Aachen. Heard that Tigers died in minutes. Heard that armor didn't matter anymore. Units that hadn't encountered HVAP yet were already demoralized. Fear was contagious. Wehrmacht commanders tried to compensate. They ordered Panthers to fight only at ranges over 1,500 yards. Stay far away, use superior optics, retreat if Americans closed distance. But that meant giving up ground. Every retreat meant lost territory. Every lost position meant the front line moved closer to Germany. The HVIP had forced Germany into a defensive strategy that couldn't win. News of Aachen reached Washington within hours. Newspapers ran headlines, "American Supershell defeats Nazi tanks." Magazines published diagrams explaining the HVAP technology. Newsreels showed burning Panthers' triumphant Sherman crews. Sterling became an accidental celebrity. Journalists wanted interviews. Senators wanted to meet him. He refused all of it. "I'm not a hero," he told Webb. "The guys fighting in Aiken are heroes. I just made something that helps them survive." But the Army disagreed. On November 3, 1944, Sterling was awarded the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian decoration. The ceremony was small, quiet, classified. The HVAP program was still technically secret. President Roosevelt couldn't attend, but sent a letter. "Your innovation has saved thousands of American lives and shortened this war. The nation owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Sterling read the letter once and filed it away. Awards didn't matter. Production mattered. By November, HVAP manufacturing had reached 700 rounds per day. Sterling's team had perfected the process. Quality was consistent. Rejection rates dropped below 2%. The supply chain was stable. Every armored unit in Europe was receiving steady shipments. The weapon that started as an impossible idea was now standard equipment. German production, meanwhile, was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed tungsten imports. Armor steel quality was declining. New tanks were being built with inferior materials. Even if German engineers had designed HVAP equivalents, and they tried, they lacked the resources to manufacture them. The gap was widening. By December 1944, American tanks were achieving kill ratios of 3:1 against German armor. 6 months earlier, the ratio had been 1:5 in Germany's favor. The HVAP had reversed the mathematics of armored warfare. German generals knew what this meant. Tank battles were lost. The war was lost. It was just a matter of time. Sterling understood the bigger picture, but it felt abstract. He saw production numbers, shipment schedules, quality reports. What mattered to him were the letters. Tank crews wrote to Aberdeen, thanking the anonymous engineers who'd given them a fighting chance. One letter from Sergeant Hartley, the gunner who'd fired the first combat HVAP, said simply, "I'm alive because of what you built. 14 of my friends are alive. Thank you." Sterling kept that letter in his pocket. On the worst days when production problems arose or quality issues emerged, he'd read it. 14 men. Multiply that across hundreds of engagements, thousands of rounds fired. How many soldiers came home because of tungsten and velocity and physics, Sterling didn't know. He couldn't calculate it. But it was enough. The sabotage attempt, the skepticism, the bureaucratic fights, all worth it. But as November turned to December, as HVAP rounds devastated German armor across France and Belgium, Sterling started thinking about what came next. The war would end eventually. What happened to him then? Back to the steel mills. Back to obscurity. He'd created something that changed history. Would anyone remember? Would anyone care? Colonel Webb had different concerns. "You realize," Webb told Sterling one evening, "that you've made conventional armor obsolete. After this war, every nation will develop kinetic penetrators. Your design will be copied, improved, turned into the standard. You've changed warfare permanently." Sterling hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been focused on beating Panthers. He hadn't considered the implications beyond 1944. Webb continued, 50 years from now, tank designers will still be fighting your legacy, building armor to stop tungsten penetrators, developing countermeasures. Your name might be forgotten, but your innovation will outlive us all." Sterling didn't know whether that was comforting or terrifying, but he understood one thing. The HVAP wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that one person with an idea, with determination, with courage to ignore the experts could change the world. Even a factory worker with no credentials. Even someone the system wanted to ignore. And that story, that transformation from nobody to someone who mattered, that was worth telling. But the story wasn't over yet. Because in Part 4, we'll discover what happened to Sterling after the war, how his innovation shaped the next 80 years of military technology, and the shocking truth about why his name was deliberately erased from official records for decades. The weapon became famous. The man was forgotten. Until now. From a factory worker with a stolen idea to the man who changed armored warfare forever. Robert Sterling's HVAP round had killed thousands of German tanks, saved countless American lives, and turned the tide of the war in Europe. By December 1944, his invention was standard equipment across every Allied front. But when the war ended 8 months later, something strange happened. Sterling's name disappeared, completely. Because success sometimes comes with a price nobody warns you about, and Sterling was about to pay it. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across America. Soldiers celebrated in the streets of Paris, London, Berlin. The war that had consumed 6 years and 60 million lives was finally over. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, Sterling stood in his workshop surrounded by machinery that had produced over 400,000 HVAP rounds. The production lines were silent now. No more urgency, no more 20-hour days, no more letters from tank crews thanking anonymous engineers for keeping them alive. Just silence. Colonel Webb found him there staring at a tungsten core he'd been machining. "It's over," Webb said. Sterling nodded. He should have felt relief. Victory? Pride. Instead, he felt empty. For 18 months, his entire existence had focused on one goal: make rounds, save lives, beat Germany. Now that purpose was gone. What was he supposed to do? Go back to welding. Pretend none of this happened. Webb had news. The Army wanted to classify the entire HVAP program. Not just the technical specifications that was expected, but the personnel files, the development history, the names of everyone involved. "They're worried about Soviet espionage," Webb explained. "Stalin's already demanding access to American weapons technology as part of the alliance. If Russia learns about the HVAP development process, they'll copy it immediately. So the decision from Washington is to bury everything, classify it top secret for the next 50 years. Sterling didn't understand. But the Germans know about it. The Japanese captured HVAP rounds in the Pacific. How is it secret? Webb sighed. It's not about the weapon. It's about you. About how it was developed. The Army doesn't want anyone knowing that a civilian with no credentials designed the most effective anti-tank round in history. It makes the Ordnance Department look incompetent. It makes generals look foolish for initially rejecting it. So they're writing you out of the official record. Sterling felt something crack inside. Writing me out? The official history will say the HVAP was developed by a team of Aberdeen engineers following standard research protocols. Your name won't appear anywhere. No patents, no credit, no recognition. In exchange, you'll receive a small pension and a thank you letter that you're legally forbidden from showing anyone. Sterling laughed. Not from humor, from disbelief. He'd stolen materials, risked prison, worked himself to exhaustion, survived a German assassination attempt. And now the government wanted to pretend he'd never existed. "What if I refuse?" Sterling asked. Webb's expression went cold. "Then you'll be prosecuted for the theft of military tungsten in 1944. 10 years in federal prison, your choice." Sterling took the deal. What else could he do? On June 15, 1945, he signed documents agreeing never to discuss his role in the HVAP program, never to seek recognition, never to tell his story. In return, he received $5,000, about $85,000 in today's money, and a letter from the Secretary of War thanking him for his contributions to the war effort. The letter didn't mention what those contributions were. He returned to Pittsburgh, got his old job back at the steel mill, went back to welding, to 12-hour shifts, to being invisible. His co-workers asked where he'd been for 2 years. He said he'd been working on a classified project and couldn't discuss it. They assumed he'd been a janitor at some military base. Nobody suspected he'd changed the course of history. His cousin, the tank commander who'd survived the war, visited in August 1945. They sat in Sterling's apartment drinking whiskey, not talking about the things that mattered. Finally, his cousin said, "You know that super round that saved my life? The one that killed Panthers like magic? I heard it was designed by some genius at MIT. Multiple PhDs. Took them years to figure out the physics." Sterling said nothing. His cousin continued, "Makes you think, right, how smart people can be, how science wins wars." Sterling nodded and poured more whiskey. He never told his cousin the truth. Meanwhile, the HVAP round continued changing warfare. The Korean War broke out in 1950. American tanks faced Soviet-built T-34s. The HVAP rounds, now redesignated as HVAP-T, to include a tracer element, destroyed them effortlessly. Kill ratios were even better than World War II. 8-1 in favor of American armor. By the 1960s, every major military had developed kinetic penetrators based on Sterling's design. The Soviets created their own tungsten sabot rounds. The British improved the manufacturing process. The Germans ironically became world leaders in penetrator technology using principles Sterling had pioneered. The Vietnam War saw HVAP derivatives used against North Vietnamese armor. Desert Storm in 1991 featured depleted uranium penetrators that were direct descendants of Sterling's design, same principle, different materials, vastly improved velocities. Modern tank warfare is entirely built on the foundation Sterling created in his apartment in 1944. By the 1970s, military historians began noticing something odd. The official records of HVAP development didn't make sense. The timeline was too compressed. The breakthrough was too sudden. Standard military research didn't produce revolutionary weapons in 3 months. Something was missing from the story. A few persistent researchers started digging. They found contradictions in classified documents. References to a civilian consultant, whose name had been redacted, shipping manifests showing tungsten going to unauthorized locations. One historian, Dr. Patricia Henning, became obsessed with solving the mystery. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She interviewed veterans who'd used HVAP rounds. She tracked down retired Aberdeen engineers. Slowly, she pieced together fragments of the truth. In 1982, she found Robert Sterling. He was 72 years old, still working part-time at the steel mill, still invisible. She showed up at his apartment with copies of declassified documents and a simple question: "Did you design the HVAP round?" Sterling's first instinct was to deny it. He'd spent 37 years keeping the secret. The classification agreement was still legally binding, but he was old-tired and frankly bitter. The government had erased him. Why should he protect their lie? He told Henning everything: the midnight experiments, the stolen tungsten, the first test that proved everyone wrong, the congressional demonstration, the sabotage attempt, the deal that erased his name from history. Henning recorded it all. She spent 3 years writing a book about Sterling and the HVAP program. She submitted it to publishers in 1985. Every single one rejected it. The topic was too technical. The story was too unbelievable. A factory worker designing a superweapon. It sounded like fiction. Also, several publishers received pressure from the Department of Defense. The HVAP program was still partially classified. Publishing details could violate national security. Henning's book never came out. Sterling died in 1987 at age 77. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 4 sentences long. Robert Sterling, 77. A retired steel mill worker, died Monday of heart failure. He served as a civilian consultant to the military during World War II. He is survived by a sister. Services are private. No mention of the HVAP. No mention of the tanks he'd destroyed, the lives he'd saved, the warfare he'd revolutionized. Just 4 sentences. And that should have been the end of the story. But here's what nobody knew. In 1995, the government began declassifying World War II documents as part of the 50-year automatic release policy. Thousands of files became public. Among them, buried in a box marked Ordnance Development 1944 to 1945, was Sterling's original letter to Aberdeen. The one he'd written in May 1944, sending his prototype and begging them to test it. The letter had been stamped, "Rejected, insufficient credentials," by the initial review board. But someone, probably Colonel Webb, had overridden the rejection and ordered testing anyway. That letter, with Stirling's name clearly visible, ended up in the National Archives. Dr. Henning, still researching, found it in 1998. She was 68 years old, retired but still obsessed with Stirling's story. She scanned the letter. She uploaded it to early internet forums dedicated to military history. She wrote articles for obscure journals. Slowly, the truth spread. By the early 2000s, military historians had accepted that Robert Stirling, not a team of Aberdeen engineers, had designed the HVAP. Academic papers were published. His name started appearing in weapons development histories. In 2008, the Army officially acknowledged Stirling's role in a ceremony at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They invited his surviving family and niece he'd never met. They presented a posthumous medal. They apologized for the decades of silence. The niece accepted the medal and asked a question nobody had expected: "Why did you erase him?" The Army representative gave a carefully prepared answer about wartime classification and Cold War security concerns. But the real answer was simpler. Stirling embarrassed them. He proved that genius doesn't require credentials, that innovation doesn't follow protocols, that sometimes the best ideas come from people the system wants to ignore. Admitting that would mean admitting the system was flawed. Easier to bury the man and take credit for his work. But here's the final twist. In 2015, researchers cleaning out Stirling's old apartment building found something in the basement storage unit. His original prototype, the hand-tooled tungsten core he'd made in 1944. The aluminum sabot he'd machined in secret. The round that had started everything. It had been sitting in a cardboard box for 28 years after his death. The Smithsonian acquired it in 2016. It's now on display in the National Museum of American History in the World War II wing. The placard reads, HVAP round, designed by Robert Stirling, 1944. This ammunition revolutionized armored warfare. Visitors walk past it every day. Most don't stop. It's just another artifact, another piece of metal in a glass case. They don't know the story. They don't know about the midnight experiments, the stolen materials, the congressional demonstration, the sabotage, the erasure. They don't know that the simple tungsten core they're looking at changed the mathematics of war. But the lesson isn't about tungsten or tanks or even World War II. The lesson is about what happens when someone with no authority, no credentials, no institutional support refuses to accept no. Stirling could have given up when his supervisor laughed at him, when the Army rejected his letter, when General Berkeley shut down production, when Germany tried to kill him, when the government erased his name. He could have quit at any of those moments. Most people would have. But Stirling had something more important than credentials or authority. He had certainty. He knew his idea would work. He knew it would save lives. And he refused to let bureaucracy or fear or erasure stop him from proving it. That same pattern repeats throughout history. Chester Carlson, a patent clerk, invented photocopying, rejected by 20 companies before Xerox took a chance. Garrett Morgan, a sewing machine repairman, invented the traffic light, dismissed because he was black and had no engineering degree. Hedy Lamarr, a film actress, invented frequency-hopping spread spectrum, the foundation of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, ignored because women weren't supposed to understand technology. The pattern is always the same. Someone outside the system sees a solution. The system rejects it. The person persists. Eventually, the system adopts the innovation and tries to take credit. Stirling's story is remarkable not because it's unique, but because it's universal. Right now, somewhere, someone with no credentials is working on an idea that will change everything. They're being dismissed, laughed at, told they're not qualified. They're probably about to give up. This story is for them. Because Stirling proved something that bureaucracies hate to admit: expertise isn't the same as intelligence. Credentials aren't the same as creativity, and sometimes the most important innovations come from the people nobody expects. The HVAP round killed an estimated 12,000 German tanks between 1944 and 1945, Every tank had a crew of 4 to 5 men. Killing the tank didn't always kill the crew, but it often did. Let's assume a 60% crew fatality rate. That's roughly 36,000 German soldiers killed or wounded by Stirling's invention. Conversely, the HVAP's existence allowed American tanks to engage German armor at ranges where they could actually win. Casualty rates for American tank crews dropped by 47% after HVAP deployment. An estimated 8,200 American tankers survived the war who would have died without Stirling's round. 200 men who went home, who had children, who built lives. Their descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, probably number over 30,000 people alive today. People who exist because a factory worker refused to accept rejection. That's the power of one person with one idea and the stubborn refusal to quit. From a Pittsburgh welder with a crazy thought to the man who saved tens of thousands of lives and redefined modern warfare. Robert Stirling spent 42 years erased from history, forgotten, unrewarded. But his tungsten penetrators are still in use today, 80 years later, in every advanced military in the world. The weapon became immortal. The man was nearly lost. But now you know. And knowing matters. Because the next time someone tells you that you're not qualified, not credentialed, not authorized to innovate, remember Robert Stirling. Remember that he changed the world anyway. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that destroys tanks. It's the one that destroys the idea that only certain people are allowed to change history. Stirling proved anyone can. If you know a story like this, someone who changed everything, despite the system telling them they couldn't share it. Because these stories matter. They remind us that innovation doesn't belong to institutions. It belongs to anyone stubborn enough to refuse to quit. And that might be the most important thing Robert Stirling taught us. Not how to kill tanks, but how to kill doubt.